Good day to everybody. I just wanted to introduce the panel, first of all, before we go any further. So we have with us Noel Tomnay of Wood Mackenzie, Ahmed Eldessouky, EY Consulting, and Robin Mills, CEO of Qamar Energy. And we are in different parts of the world, but we will be looking both at the global gas LNG market as well as a focus on MENA region. So we've seen demand destruction. Oil and coal have been hit more than gas. LNG has fared slightly better than pipeline gas during this crisis, but there are a lot of question marks as to, when the market will tighten, how much pressure there is on the exporters to amend their contracts, given that the gas prices have actually fallen to record levels. I think they're moving back up again. So I wanted to ask Noel to sort of maybe give us an overview of where the market stands at the moment and what impact it's having on the exporters in the Middle East and MENA region. And also maybe if we can look at how gas used to be seen as sort of the cleaner of the fossil fuels, but now there's a lot of focus on methane emissions, a lot of pressure on exporters to decarbonize. So perhaps you can set the stage for the conversation. Over to you, Noel.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks very much. In terms of what's happened over the last 9 months, it has been an utterly miserable experience for gas producers and for the LNG market. So, as Kate said, we've had record low gas prices, at least by recent historical levels, and what we've had is a lot of LNG output being curtailed. Now, most of that curtailment has been happening from the US. Why? Because in the US, you effectively have to take LNG, you have to buy your gas, and then you have to, from the grid, you have to liquefy it and then export it. So but you might elect not to buy the gas and not to export it. So you've got quite a bit of flexibility there. And the fact you have to buy it and you have that added cost, if you've got that flexibility, you could forgo that cost. And the prices internationally were so low that they were lower sometimes than actually the price of buying US gas. So consequently, there was certainly no incentive to liquefy it and ship it anywhere. So we did see a lot of US LNG being curtailed and not being exported during the summer. But now we've got international gas prices back up to levels in Europe and in Asia, around $5.50, back to price levels that they were before the pandemic, and much more sort of attitude as business as usual, with the expectation of very limited curtailments of US LNG through this winter. So in many ways, it's the LNG market is back to where it was. But what has been the implications in the longer term for what that might mean for the Middle East? Because in the shorter term, the Middle East, the producers, their costs are very low, much lower than US LNG. So they've just kept producing their cash costs. They've just kept producing and effectively making a margin. So it's almost as if they haven't really seen a significant impact on themselves. And in the longer term, I'd actually say this is good news. What's happened is very good for Middle East, North Africa LNG producers. Why? Because they already have excellent infrastructure upon which they had plans to develop brownfield developments. No one was really talking about greenfield LNG. So whether you're in Qatar or Oman or Egypt, any of these countries which were planning to do new LNG projects, they were always going to be a lower kind of quartile sort of LNG developers for new LNG capacity in the future. So if they have the gas and are able to develop that LNG capacity, their advantage, because a lot of those other LNG producers that were going to produce before the pandemic and were trying to launch those new LNG projects are now struggling to get those off the ground, recognizing that they're high cost projects, that are more difficult to raise capital, and they're just not going to go anywhere. They've completely hit the buffers. So for the Middle East, North Africa, whilst they might not, lots of folks out there might not yet feel it now, I think this is going to be a very positive experience because they're going to be kicking at an open goal in the future in terms of a lack of competition, a more ready, open set of customers and market, and a much greater marketing opportunity for actually getting that LNG to market. So I think this is good news. I think also if you look at the carbon output of Middle East LNG, Middle East North Africa LNG against a lot of other LNG producers, you'll actually see it too is very favourable. A lot of LNG, not a lot, but some LNG buyers are starting to ask for comparisons of the carbon emissions footprint of LNG supply for comparative purposes. Singapore's recently done that. You've seen some Japanese buyers trying to buy carbon neutral LNG. So, but as you look at that through the value chain, you're then talking about, well, do you vent carbon in your upstream? Do you vent carbon dioxide? A lot of them do. Do you have methane that are leaking from your wellheads? Something that's quite common in the US, and it's been a bit of an issue in some places in Russia. So you start to go through the list, and well, Malaysia has a lot of high carbon fields, as does Australia. That's not very good. US has got this methane, and Russia's got this methane. That's not very good. And actually, you look at a lot of the Middle East, North Africa fields, and they're quite well controlled in terms of these elements. So the carbon footprint of Middle East, North Africa LNG, I think we've been doing a lot of studies in this area, and I think you'll see that they actually look quite favourable. So another good reason to be looking at Middle East, North Africa LNG from the perspective of a more ready market. So it's been quite a good year for Middle East, North Africa LNG.
Thank you, Noel, for that overview. I remember many years ago, I met Saad Al-Kaabi before he became chairman of QP, and he said to me, he introduced himself and he said, "You can call me Mr. Moratorium." And that was when, of course, Qatar had decided not to go ahead with any further expansion. And now, of course, they're talking about 126, maybe even going beyond that. I mean, are we setting ourselves up for a demand bubble? I think, Robin, you've actually written a book, which I have right in front of me here, about sort of, gas in GCC countries. So how do we see a possible demand bubble emerging? And I wanted to also ask you, do we see any other exporters other than Qatar emerging in the Middle East? I know that Oman is maybe looking to export more. If the UAE manages to get self-sufficiency in gas with their new gas developments, are they going to be looking to export more? So maybe you can give us more of a sort of focus on the GCC, the MENA area.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kate. Look, I think there's a very interesting kind of challenge here, which comes out of the history of the last 10 to 15 years, when the Middle East and in particular the GCC region were running short of gas, and demand was growing very strongly, and supply wasn't keeping up, largely because prices were too low and commercial terms were not attractive enough, and the NOCs had fallen behind in developing the gas that was required. And that was when you had projects like these LNG import facilities being developed in the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, and so on. And you had Oman's LNG plant was running well below capacity. So that, there's genuine shortage of gas at that point. And in response, the region has developed a huge amount of new gas, obviously the very large tight gas Khazan field in Oman, more and more unconventional gas being developed in Saudi Arabia, UAE developing large sour gas fields. So, there's a lot of new gas coming, maybe delayed a year or so by the pandemic, but it is going to turn up. And the challenge then is, so what's going to happen with all this new gas? We need to see what the region's economic recovery is like when and hopefully if and when the pandemic eases off. Interesting, gas demand this year has actually been pretty strong in the region, I think, because people are staying at home and they're not leaving in the summer, and there's a lot of air conditioning running in the summer that normally wouldn't, and so the summer demand was even stronger this year than previous years. But that pattern presumably will go away in a more normal situation, and then we're in a case in which GCC, if oil prices are still fairly low, GCC growth is probably also fairly low. So there may not be the very strong domestic demand growth that had been expected before. There's also a lot of new power generation coming online, nuclear power in the UAE, and coal, and a lot of solar, and we will see more and more solar over the next decade, particularly in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, and then generally in the region. So these countries have then got to look at what are they going to do with this gas, and it's relatively high cost gas. We're talking about tight gas, shale gas development, sour gas. Depends on the nature of the resource. Now, obviously, Qatar is in its own case. Qatar's new gas is very, very cheap, but that is kind of a unique case, because the rest of the gas being developed in the region, production costs are, the low end perhaps $2.50, but they are going up into $5 and $6 at the higher end. And then the challenge is there with relatively expensive gas. You can put it into industry, but then are you going to be competitive against, let's say, US industry based on shale gas, or Chinese industry with those feedstock prices? Or you can put it into LNG exports. But again, I think if you compare to your potential for the US LNG exports, which are, as Noel reminds us, that they're a mix of greenfield and brownfield, some of them low cost, some of them a little bit higher. Shipping costs are higher to Asia from the US than from the Gulf. So the Gulf has advantages, but still the feedstock cost into Gulf LNG plants, cannot be more than $3.50, $4, you would think, and probably has to be a bit lower to be really competitive. If the production costs are higher than that, it's going to be hard to make it work. And exactly as Noel explains in the case of Egypt, Egypt is paying between $4 to $5.50 for the more expensive deep water gas, and it isn't even economic to put that into an existing LNG plant, let alone to build a new one. Now, yeah, sure, we expect LNG prices to recover somewhat from where they were over this summer, but nevertheless, I think filling up existing LNG plants, yeah, sure. Building new ones for anybody except Qatar is going to be tough. Oman, can do some debottlenecking. That's probably relatively cheap. But if you talk about significant new LNG capacity, then I think it's going to be challenging. The upstream costs have got to come down. And then the same really applies to LNG imports. Again, if domestic gas demand is relatively low, and if solar power, as it does, looks extremely cheap, that will be the method of choice of power generation instead of imported LNG. If LNG prices long term have bounced back to $6, $7.
Thank you, Robin. I'm going to move on to Ahmed, who is actually in Qatar, so we'll get a sort of view from Qatar itself. The gas was, natural gas was seen very much as a transition fuel in a sort of in the transition to a lower carbon economy. There's more and more focus now on methane emissions, and I know that Qatar is positioning itself to export to launch this carbon capture and storage facility in order to be able to export carbon neutral cargoes to Asia. And of course, we've seen Europe is tightening up on its regulations. Methane, there's the NG deal, which is on hold because of the US's track record on methane emissions and flaring. So Ahmed, how is Qatar positioning itself to renegotiate these contracts that are about to expire? And is it and how is it going to be easy to finance these these expansions into new trains, 2, 4, possibly 6 eventually? Over to you, Ahmed.
Right. Well, thank you, Kate. So Qatar is, recent history tells us that they're quite flexible on their pricing. But see, it's in a well-supplied market. It's not easy to win on both volumes and price. But Qatar's low production cost, as mentioned by Rob and Noel and Alex, allows it to offer terms that few, if any, competing suppliers can match. And we've seen recent deals that QP either entered into or is about to enter into with the Korea Gas, with Sinopec, that suggests that at least in the short term, they're going to be willing to make concessions on prices to lock up long-term contracts. But I also believe that Qatar has somewhat of an upper hand in this renegotiation process if it were to take place, not only because of its low production cost, low carbon efficient production cost, if I may, but also because it has one of the most resilient LNG supply chains in the world. So, Kate, that supply chain only consists of three main components: the exploration and production, treatment and liquefaction, and the shipping and distributions. So, one, Qatar has very low production cost. Two, liquefaction and treatment. Qatar is, has probably more LNG trains than any other producer, with more trains on the contract for the North Field expansion. And then three, on shipping, as Alex mentioned earlier, we've all heard of this historic deal, worth about $20 billion to build 100 vessels. So all that said, international buyers are basically looking for more reliable sellers that they can trust. And in my opinion, that would help Qatar maintain, if not add to that market share, with, despite any fluctuation in price, the overall revenue shouldn't necessarily be proportionally impacted. And last thing I want to say, His Excellency Al-Kaabi, the CEO of QP and Minister of Energy, when he was asked about some buyers claiming force majeure, seeking to delay loading of LNG cargoes under long-term deals due to the demand drop, he responded by saying there are partners for the long run and will support them in times of need, which was a powerful statement in my opinion. So yes, I don't think their revenues necessarily, despite of price fluctuations, may be impacted as much. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. I wanted to ask all of you, and I don't know who wants to take this, but China has announced that it plans to become carbon neutral by 2060, Japan by 2050, Europe already leading the way. And of course, we don't know the outcome of the US election yet, but any trade deal with China involves LNG. So how do we see China playing out as, since it is one of the biggest destinations for Middle Eastern gas and oil, of course, but does anybody want to take this one and comment on the impact of China's policies on demand? Yeah, okay, Noel, please go ahead.
Well, I can start. I mean, certainly Wood Mackenzie's view is that China's LNG imports by the end of this year will be, I think it's about 3% higher than last year. So it's continuing to grow, and its incremental demand is larger than any other country year on year. So it continues to drive the LNG market. And there are rumors that they will be getting a deal possibly with Qatar or announced very soon into China. So there is a strong expectation that China will continue to really drive that market. Now, in terms of carbon neutral, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, it's going to be exactly what that means or what time frame, but the Chinese buyers are out in force, and the Chinese economy is tearing away from the rest of the world at the moment in terms of the Chinese stock market is tearing away, and it seems very well poised to continue to drive that. So it does seem very much like a blip in terms of the very short-term impact that recent events have had in China, and the Chinese buyers could come out very strong in terms of their influence, and are able to much more than any other country are able to call the shots in terms of price expectations and requirements.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in if I may, Kate. Look, I think one other thing in China, the latest development, the launch of Pipe China, this new pipeline company where they've basically folded the pipeline assets of CNP, Sinopec, CNOOC, and the others into a new, partly owned by those incumbent companies, owned by other institutions as well. And I think this will be very important for opening up third-party access to Chinese gas pipelines, which has been an issue, getting more third-party LNG terminals open and connected to the network, connecting up industrial demand inland. So I think this will be strongly supported in terms of developing the industrial market and the residential heating market in China, which has been one of the bottlenecks over the past couple of years.
Yes, some people sort of portray China as, oh, well, you have all this gas coming from East Russia now, the LNG market. So it's no longer about LNG, it's all about Russia pipe. It's about both, right? And the fact is, you try and get East Russia gas down to Guangdong and Guangxi, that's a long way. And that's very much an easy LNG market. So the fact is, LNG will compete with Russia gas on cost. It will be competitive. It's not about LNG is about security supply and Russia's about base load. No, this is about LNG can compete with Russia gas, absolutely, and it's about both, and also the demand is very seasonal as well in terms of seasonal fluctuations, and that also plays very heavily to LNG's advantages for winter supply as well, which is interesting because it does show that you're going to have I really, in terms of that sway as China demand continues to grow and its winter demand continues to be very strong. For me, it points to a world in which there's going to be less LNG available to Europe in the winter than it wants, which plays to Russia pipe.
Thank you. No, Ahmed, do you have anything that you would like to add before we move on to?
Not on the Chinese front, no, Kate.
It's obviously a big market for Qatar as well. Let's move on to, we haven't seen any final investment decisions in...
You're on mute, Kate. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, we haven't seen any final investment decisions in 2020 so far, which is sort of understandable. So where do we see the next sort of spurt in exports? Is it Egypt? Is it any other country? I'm trying to move the conversation away from Qatar. We know where Qatar stands. We know they're expanding. We know they'll probably be able to either self-finance or find some way of doing it. We've seen some project delays, but it's mostly to bring down costs. So you have this sort of pressure on price, but at the same time, you have other aspiring exporters. So who are the likely exporters to emerge as demand picks up? And we have seen it pick up, particularly in Asia.
Well, I think, we can pick up many, obviously all around the world. US projects have struggled this year. Some of them will go ahead. A lot of them will drop out. Mozambique in theory, is pretty competitive, particularly for South Asia. Big projects in a developing country, and the corona has certainly held that up. But at least on a theoretical basis, Mozambique is pretty competitive. But if we look around MENA, I'll kind of reiterate that I think it's with the exception of Qatar, as always, it's a challenge to get significant new LNG out. Now, obviously, Egypt, you've got the issue of restarting Damietta, and if the LNG prices are reasonable, if they can reach some commercial arrangement, that restarts. And if IDCO is running at full capacity, then that is a significant amount more LNG out of Egypt. But again, with the costs of feed gas in Egypt or Cyprus or Israel, it's still for me quite hard to see that there'll be any greenfield expansions or greenfield projects launched in the East Med.
Well, I hope this isn't your last. I hope this isn't the last disagreement that the conference is going to get today. But I don't agree with Robert on this. So the fact is, Mozambique, and we all wish Mozambique well, and the Area 1 project's already going ahead. but it is a new, it does require a lot of infrastructure. ExxonMobil is stalling on its FID in Area 4. It's not clear that it's going to go ahead anytime soon. But then when you look at Egypt, the kind of 450 that Robin refers to is that we would see that as a sort of weighted average cost of gas into Egypt. But the reality is, when you look at whether it's things like Leviathan or Aphrodite, when you look at them delivered actually into the Egyptian market, you're talking about gas that's under a couple of dollars per MMBTU. That's our view. So the question is then, well, what price are they when they come out of the export facility? And so if you treat it on an incremental basis, that they then just use the export facility as a tolling facility, and they're able to access that themselves in a commercial structure rather than going through the Egyptian roundabout of weighted average cost of gas, then they're extremely competitive. And we really see this as Egypt's opportunity to try to separate their domestic market out from the LNG export market as two quite separate markets, to encourage more gas through that facility. And so they do have ambitious plans to even do brownfield expansions beyond Damietta and ELNG existing capacity. Now, maybe that's true. There's certainly enough gas there, and the exploration potential is such that once that infrastructure is in place, I mean the pipelines as well to the facility, it's not such a crazy idea. So yeah, we think Egypt. I almost prefer the cost of I definitely prefer the cost of Egypt LNG to Mozambique LNG.
Thank you.
I would agree with Noel, but I do not disagree with Robin, and call me biased, but sometimes when people ask where's the next frontier of exporting countries, I tell them, see where QP is investing in, and follow that. So Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, and then of course Latin America. It's I mean that's where the geographical footprint of Qatar Petroleum is, and so. But again, don't call me biased. So.
Yes, of course, because Qatar has grabbed a few assets abroad as well in partnership with the majors, who nearly all of them are present in Qatar. What about Yemen? Do we see Yemen returning as an exporter, since we're trying to focus on exporters rather than importers? And do we see Yemen returning as an LNG exporter? Because I mean, that was their biggest foreign investment before before the conflict. Is that a possibility?
Just a question of security, right? The plant itself is undamaged, as we understand, but the pipeline is vulnerable, and was vulnerable even before the civil war. There were numerous attacks which were repaired, but it was still a struggle. But I think there's also a question whether the UAE influence around in that area would be sufficient to give enough security for that plant to restart. I mean, no doubt that if you can get gas supply and if security around the plant is acceptable, it could start again. Would obviously be a significant economic boost, but I imagine Total will be pretty careful about being assured of the security of the gas supply before they try to go back.
Yeah, and the market doesn't seem to be missing it. I mean, it is very well supplied. We're coming down to the last 10 minutes, I think, and I don't know if there's any questions from the audience that we haven't covered. No, I haven't heard anything. Okay, so where do we see the biggest demand? Which sectors are going to be drawing most demand for LNG? I know we're talking about exporters, but exports have to go somewhere. So is it power sector? Is it industry? What is gas going to be displacing in the transition? Is it going to be coal? Presumably mostly coal, being phased out in many places.
You're on mute.
Biggest pull in demand. Yeah, no, I'm saying, where do we see the biggest demand pull for LNG?
Well, I'll have a go, but in terms of sectors, of course, it's the power sector continues to be a big driver, but it's not all about renewables. It's about renewables and LNG and gas coexisting. But in terms of key issues in the Middle East markets, I've certainly heard Robin talk very interestingly before about the impact of associated gas being such a strong proportion of Middle East production, and being dependent on oil production, and just what that might mean for the region and for the region's gas production. I think that's something that I know Robin is. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that, Robin.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think the associated gas issue, it's an important one at the moment because of the OPEC cuts, and that has caused significant strain in terms of reducing associated gas production in the UAE and Iraq in particular, and they had to, of course, reduce their compliance over summer to have enough associated gas. Saudi Arabia, not so much, but Saudi Arabia had to up its crude burn, which had been falling. It had to burn more crude this summer, again, because of lower associated gas. And obviously, over the next few years, I think it depends on how quickly will production recover, how quickly will OPEC be able to relax its cuts, and perhaps some of these countries will go forward into their production growth plans. UAE and Iraq, again, particularly have pretty ambitious plans for production growth over the next decade. Plenty of obstacles in the way of Iraq for that. Not really any obstacles in the way of UAE, apart from is the market there and is it constrained by OPEC? So there'd be some more associated gas out of those developments, but there is very much the realization that, even more so that they need more non-associated gas to have the flexibility and not be held hostage to the associated gas. I think you see this pretty clearly in the Saudi policy and some of their not only non-associated gas, but unconventional gas developments, and even thoughts of having some volumes to be a net exporter at the end of this decade. If you look at the balances, yes, the balances do show that they could have a surplus. Whether that it'll actually materialize is another question, but at least theoretically, there's the potential for some surplus gas there. And then, if we go to Iraq, obviously the big question is capturing the current flared gas, more than a BCF a day of flared gas. And at the moment, over the past few years, they've just about kind of kept up with new oil production projects. That is, that the amount of flaring hasn't gone up, but it also hasn't decreased because the amount of associated gas keeps going up, and that probably will continue to be the case for the next few years, even as some more capture projects get taken forward. Most of those are stalled at the moment, but hopefully would resume next year.
Thank you, Robin. We have a question. One of them is about, could we elaborate more on the competitors of Egyptian gas? I think we've covered that one, but I want to move to Algeria because somebody's asked, we have from Ralash Maui about insights about Algerian gas. Very quickly, we've got a few minutes left. Who'd like to take prospects for Algerian gas? No, please.
Okay, well, the really big disappointment about Algerian gas is, in terms of exporting, is its growing Algerian demand, which requires a larger and larger proportion of gas to be used domestically. So they have a dilemma about, well, if they've got a limited amount of gas to export, what do we do? Do we send it by LNG or do we send it by pipe? And the losses in LNG are bigger than the losses in pipe. So the likelihood is that you'd expect Algeria to become a smaller and smaller exporter that focuses more and more on supplying gas to to Spain and Italy, and being less of a significant player in LNG, only responding occasionally on a flexible basis with LNG when there's some price upside. So the only way that's going to get reversed is if there's massive new investment in the Algerian upstream sector. They've got a new licensing round. The terms don't seem to be strong enough to attract interest. There's probably going to be a lot more changes required before Algeria is going to get that investment to change that outlook.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's one of the problems that Algeria's had, even though they've revised their terms so many times. But again, Algeria, like many other LNG exporters, had been banking on the US being a destination for their exports. And of course, Algeria completely lost its US market. So the competition moved a lot more fiercely to Asia. I don't know how much more time we have, but if anybody has, famous last words that they would like to, I think we have a few, 2-3 minutes left. If anybody has famous last words about where we are heading from here, and
well, one thing that we haven't covered is Turkey, and that Turkey's enjoyed some recent gas discoveries, which I think will impact. I think they're not going to be so reliant on gas from Iran. They'll certainly don't really need gas from Kurdistan. So I think it has quite a negative impact on the Middle East. I think also, Turkey has very strong political connections with Azerbaijan, and will look to leverage both that and its domestic new indigenous gas to look to export more gas to Europe, and which is a potential competitive threat for East Med gas pipeline. So it's I think it's not lots of gas reserves yet, maybe 10 TCF of recoverable, but it points to a lot of upside potential through prospectivity. So I think Turkey's become an interesting one to watch, and I'm sure there's a lot of companies will be very keen to try to invest in it.
Thank you, Noel. Do we
actually just want to ask Noel a quick question?
Yeah.
Because with Mackenzie is good at looking into the future. So by when do you think is the Black Sea gas could actually become available? Is it 6-7 years?
I think yeah, exactly. I mean, it's over 2,000 meters of water depth. It's not something Turkey is going to want to do on its own. They're going to want to have a competent partner in there, so that they do it successfully. So, I mean, even once you see that partner in, then it will be 5 years from then.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
I think also just worth commenting on Turkey, that the LNG imports this year have been extremely strong. They've really taken advantage of the low prices and their flexibility. But Turkey, it's a big gas market, but it has actually been declining over the past couple of years, just because of diversification, a lot more coal in the power sector as well as renewables. So, it's a big and interesting market, but it's not a fast growing one. It's probably a shrinking one. I think some people are still a bit in the mindset of a few years ago when it wasn't very fast growing. But I think it's now intensely competitive between Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran, LNG, its own new discovery. And then you've got, even like Kurdistan, you've got some other suppliers who are probably going to have quite a challenge to get into that market.
Oh, I still haven't been told that we have to stop, so we can carry on. We've been talking a lot about, demand, power, but isn't it true that, for example, there is very high demand in Egypt, which is why there isn't that much left for export. The pipeline that used to take Egyptian gas to Turkey is not really functioning at full capacity, and it's had a lot of issues. But aren't subsidies also an issue? I mean, the Middle East is supposed to be the biggest gas demand center after China and India. So are subsidies an issue? If you reduce subsidies further, does that free up more gas for export? Is that something that we see as necessary, sort of price reforms as part of this sort of economic diversification and less reliance on hydrocarbon revenues?
I think that's an interesting and a somewhat tricky question, right? Now, is gas being sold below the average weighted cost of production and imports in the region? No, today, mostly not. There's a new pricing scheme in Saudi Arabia. Prices have been increased. Bahrain, Oman, Egypt. Most of these countries have now got, at least they're kind of balancing the books overall. Do the prices reflect the marginal cost of new imports or new developments? No, generally not. No. So in that sense, there, you could say there is some kind of a subsidy for high cost developments. But there has been a lot of subsidy reform, price reform in gas and electricity, over the past few years. I think the issue is more the lack of a price benchmark. LNG imports, to some extent, establish a benchmark for those countries that are importing. But as you know, we have very little trade within the region between countries, and one of the big problems there is still what is the benchmark to be used for gas supply between two countries in this region, and that applies to particularly to the Gulf. The Eastern Med is starting to develop some connections, but it certainly still applies to the Gulf.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question, is that the region's been a price taker as opposed to a price maker, and there hasn't really been, or we've seen the electricity grid connection is functioning quite well, and it's going to, we're going to maybe see Iraq included in the future, but in terms of gas, we're not really seeing that much of a sort of regional, and gas is a regional market, but we're not seeing that much integration on the gas front. So that I suppose is an issue which might develop in the future, but there is geopolitics involved as well. Do we want to carry on? Again, I haven't been told that we need to stop, so I'm carrying on. The US election impact on gas, LNG, energy policy in general. I mean, we don't know the answer yet, but we can still talk about it. No? Does anybody want to take it?
Well, one thing that was thrown out was that that Biden would be very negative about US gas, because there was lots of big press about the fact that he might impose a sort of moratorium on federal land. But federal land produces a very small, for shale, but federal land for shale produces a infinitesimal amount of gas production. So in terms of the impact on output, the expectation is that it would be very small. Perhaps more meaningful would be his willingness to sort of reimpose some of the previous regulations on emissions, and which would inevitably increase perhaps the cost of some gas production. That said, a lot of the producers and state levels are already kind of implementing some of those elements anyway. Yeah. And so again, would it actually have a genuinely significant impact? Is much less ambiguous, much more ambiguous.
Thank you. We are going to have to wrap it up now. Thank you very, very much, all of you, for a very interesting conversation. We can carry on, I'm sure, but we will have to say thank you very much, and see you, hopefully not virtually, next time.